Now that we're starting to get a little bit more comfortable working with materials, let's explore how we can extend this material system to include gradients. And gradients are a great way for the computer to automatically transition from one color to another. Be aware, though, that the application of gradients is very, very different than what you're accustomed to seeing in a traditional 2D drawing or illustration application like Photoshop. It's very unique to Blender, which is why I wanted to show you how this entire system works so that we really can take advantage of it. Let's start off by going over into our material library. I've just opened up a brand new scene file here, nothing too fancy. And I'm going to go into my material library and just kind of clear out some of these materials just to make it a little bit easy. I'm going to get rid of solid stroke just by hitting the minus sign here. And I'm going to start by creating my own material. This little plus sign will start the process. Let's create a new material down here and give it a name. And I think I'm just going to call this Lovingly Pat's Gradient. There we go. And let's look at the material properties downstairs. We don't want a stroke. I want to use the fill options here, but I'm going to change the style from solid to gradient. We have one additional option here. It's texture. We'll talk about that much later in the course, but let's explore these little gradients. Now, before we go any further, let's actually create a shape so we can see how these properties are going to be affecting our material. Let's return to the draw mode. I'm just going to use let's just do a big square here. And voila, enter to return, or return key to accept the shape creation process, and we can start to see the application of this gradient inside of my square. If you look very carefully here, you can start to see that small transition from one color to another. Let's make it a little bit more extreme, and in doing so, we'll start to learn how we can work with all these properties. Now, we can change the color. Let's do that. The base color I don't want to be black. I think I want to go just from red to blue. There we go. So the base color is red. The secondary color is blue. The third thing that we need to change is this blend. Right now, it's trying to blend 50% of the red value. It's putting the opacity of the red to 50% and the opacity to blue to also to 50%. And then it's trying to blend both the fill colors, which is not what we want. We only want it to blend where those two colors intersect. So let's change the blend value to 0, and now we can start to see a little bit more what we're looking for. We're starting to see the red, we can just barely see the transition, or excuse me, we can start to see the blue, and we can just barely see that transition over there to the red. Now, I want you to be very careful. The editing of all of these values requires some incremental changes. We're not trying to have big values in the position and scale. Small little changes in values are going to have a huge effect on the gradient itself. So let's change the location here. There we go. I'm just pulling this to the left a little bit, and now we can start to see that change in value. It's going from red. We have a small little transition, and then over here into blue. So the location is what's important because that's going to determine where that transition in color takes place. How big that transition, the fall off, is established in the scale value. And we're going to do scaling along the x, so left and right. As I increase that number, you can see that the transition, the fall off between the red and the blue gets larger. As I decrease it, it starts to get much tighter. And if we get it so small, it actually flips the values, which is kind of fun. So small little movements here, not big movements, these small movements have big effects on our animation. Or excuse me, on our gradients. I misspoke. So finally, the last thing we want to change is the rotation. Maybe the rotation is where we want it to go from the top to the bottom. So I'm going to rotate it, and then I'm going to bring it down. Now the rotation is almost always going to be off screen inside of our three-dimensional universe. So what I do to combat that kind of 3D problem is that I rotate it a little bit, and then I move it down. That way I always have the line inside the screen. Let's make the scale a little bit smaller, and then it's just so I can see it a little bit more clearly, and then I'll go back in and increase the scale once I have everything rotated. Yeah, there we go. Now that I can see what I'm working with here, I can put it at 90. There we go. Let's increase the scale once again. And now we have a nice gradient of color going from the top to the bottom, which is pretty cool. So small little movements, okay? Just don't run these sliders real fast because you're not going to be able to understand, what the impact that those changes are having inside of your scene. Now, in addition to doing a linear gradient, we can also do a radial gradient. And radial gradients are a little bit more difficult to manage, but let's see if we can do it for you. We're going to change it to radial. There we go. And things are looking pretty good. As one might imagine, the same ideas. The location is going to determine where that gradient takes place, and then the scale is going to be the size of that gradient. There we go. And now we're getting a radial gradient. Now, if these values were both the same on the x and the y, it'd be perfectly circular. So we have a lot of ability here to go in and change the shape of our gradient when using a radial gradient. It's always going to be, circular in some capacity, but it's still pretty cool. Let's change the colors just to kind of make it a little bit more fun. And this kind of speaks to the power of working with gradients inside of Blender. We can even go in and draw some additional shapes that continue to use that gradient as its core material. Hit the return key, and then there we go. This illustrates quite wonderfully the power of this material system, but where gradients start to come into maybe some deficit, if you will, some problems out there. You can see on my circle here, the gradient starts off. Okay, so if I wanted to have that circle or the center of my radial gradient be in the center of my circle, I'm going to have to make some adjustments here. And let's do this. It's so big, it's kind of difficult to see. Yeah, there it is. But you can see how it's having an impact on the square behind it, right? So it's small little movements go a long way. If in this case, if I wanted the look of the sphere to be separate from the square, I'd probably want to have two different materials where I can control the gradient independently on each one, just to get a little bit more of a uniform color and or just a little bit more control over where the start and stop of all these gradients reside inside the shape itself. So that's how we work with gradients inside of Blender. They're a material property. You can do it for the fill, and you can also do it not on the strokes, I apologize. It's just on the fills, but you can do both linear gradients and radial gradients right here in Blender.